Well, welcome back. We're talking about the restoration of full diplomatic relations between Cuba and the United States. Barbara Lee has been a member of the United States Congress since 1998, a longtime advocate for diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Cuba. She joins us from outside the new Cuban embassy right here in Washington. Congresswoman Lee, thanks for joining us. You've made something like 20 trips to Cuba over the years. You've been a long-time supporter of lifting the embargo, restoring diplomatic relations with the island nation. What does today mean to you?
Well, this is a great day. We see every now and then a glimmer of hope, and this is one of those glimmer of hopes for understanding and for peace and for normal relations between our two countries. Actually, I was here in 1977 working for our great statesman, Congressman Ron Dellums, when the intersection was opened. I have been to Cuba more than 20 times since the 70s, and you know, I've always believed that the people of the United States and the people of Cuba should really get to know each other. Our foreign policy should be respectful, and that this embargo should end, and that we should lift the travel ban. So today is one step in that direction, and I have to just commend President Obama. He campaigned on a campaign of change. This is what change is all about.
Now, talking about lifting that travel embargo, you are sponsoring legislation in the U.S. Congress to get that embargo lifted, to even get the trade embargo lifted. As you know, there are leaders in the opposition right here in the United States, in the Republican Party, that strongly oppose those measures that you are talking about. In fact, we have Senator Marco Rubio, the Republican senator from Florida, who's saying that if he comes into any position of power, he's going to roll back all these efforts to restore relations with Cuba. Do you think your legislation has any chance of passing in Congress, given that the Republicans control both the Senate and the House of Representatives?
We're going to keep trying. 80% of the American public support lifting the embargo and the travel ban. And so it took us this long just to get to this point. So there's no way we're going to let a group of right-wing Tea Party-driven Republicans stop us from lifting this travel ban. Now, it may not happen tomorrow because, of course, we've got to build the political will. But I hope the public will insist that their congresspersons sign on as co-sponsors both to lifting the travel ban and lifting the embargo, because Americans deserve the right to travel to Cuba just as they can go to China, Vietnam, any other country. And so this is in America's national interest to do that. You know, the members of Congress who are opposed to it, they're living in 54 years ago. This is 2015. They need to catch up, they need to get with it, and they need to move forward so that we can have the dialogue and bring all the issues that both countries have to deal with to the table and move forward toward our whole efforts in global peace and security. And that's what this is about.
Now that diplomatic relations have been restored and we see the Cuban flag flying there behind you, what do you believe are the priorities for the two countries?
The priorities for me would be lifting the embargo and lifting the travel ban and getting these bills passed through Congress. That's going to mean the public has to organize. This is a political movement that has to be debated. It has to be organized. People have to mobilize to get their members of Congress to really follow their lead since the public supports it. So those are the two things we have to do. Lift the embargo, lift the travel ban. Congress can do that. The president is certainly doing his part.
And of course, there are a lot of issues to be resolved, things like economic reparations. Do you see progress on things like that?
There's dialogue going on, and really some informal dialogue has been taking place for many years. And so this is one step toward putting all of the issues, both from the Cuban side and the American side, on the table. But we need to lift the embargo and need to lift the travel ban. But in the meantime, with what the president has done through these executive actions, we will have a chance now to talk to the Cuban government about our issues. The Cuban government will have a chance to talk to the American government about their issues.
It's a big day, a historic day, restoration of relations between the U.S. and Cuba. Which side do you believe has gained most from this?
Both sides gain, and I think it's the American people who gain and the Cuban people who gain. Plus, let me just tell you, you know, when you talk about investments in Cuba from U.S. businesses, that creates jobs in America, and we can't forget that. And so while there's some openings for investments in the pharmaceutical industry, in the agricultural industry, we still need to lift the full embargo, but the gains on the American side will certainly be the creation of jobs and economic growth in our own country as a result of normalizing relations.
Congresswoman Barbara Lee, thanks for joining us. Now, this September marks the 55th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic ties between China and Cuba. Joining us from Beijing is Jia Xiudong. He's a senior research fellow at the China Institute of International Studies. Mr. Jia, thanks for joining us. Now, China and Cuba have had full diplomatic relations since 1960, and of course, since the 90s, there's been a growing economic relationship between these two countries. So how worried is Beijing about this relationship between the United States and Cuba?
Actually, no. China is not worried by the improved relations between the United States and Cuba. As a matter of fact, China welcomes and supports the move taken by the two countries to normalize and improve their relations. And this position has been expressed by the spokesperson of the Chinese Foreign Ministry time and over. Actually, for China believes that this is an overdue, long overdue move that should have been taken by the United States to resume its diplomatic relations with Cuba. Actually, in the past few decades, at the United Nations, China has voted with other countries at the General Assembly for a resolution which has called for the United States to drop its embargo against Cuba to improve relations with Cuba. So there is no way that China is worried about the relationship between the United States and Cuba.
But if we look at the practical implications of this improving relationship between the United States and Cuba, you know, we had the Chinese Vice Premier, Wang Yang, who visited Cuba just very recently. He signed an economic and technical cooperation agreement. In fact, China is now Cuba's second biggest economic partner after Venezuela. And there's been something like $1.3 billion in exports to Cuba from China. So is it likely that China's Chinese exporters will now be affected by this improving relationship between Washington and Havana?
Well, I don't see any significant impact of the relations between, improved relations between the United States and Cuba on China's economic and trade presence in Cuba, because for China and Cuba economic relations, it's kind of very complementary economic and trade relationship. China exports to Cuba what it needs most, like the machinery. And actually, China is a top trade partner of many countries in Latin America. Actually, in most major economies in Latin America have China as their #1 trade partner. So actually, China welcomes a future possible improved investment environment for other countries with improved trade and economic relations between the United States and Cuba. Just like what China has been doing in Cuba helps improve the economic conditions in Cuba for other countries. So this kind of win-win scenario for both China and the United States. So I don't see any negative impact on China-Cuba economic trade relations.
What about the strategic relationship between China and Cuba? China's highest-ranking military official, General Fan Changlong, visited Cuba last month. Is it likely that the strategic relationship between China and Cuba will change now that the United States has entered the picture?
No, actually not. And China, yes, does have a male-to-male relationship with Cuba. For example, China exports some military aircraft to Cuba, but not at a very high volume. And also, the delegations from both militaries visit each other. They have exchanges of military delegations, also in training in military education, and so on and so forth. And actually, with improved U.S.-Cuba relationship, Cuba will be actually will open the doors even wider to the outside world. And that relationship will help measures in Cuba reform-oriented measures in Cuba. And so that will actually make the life of China much even easier, because China will be no longer worried about reaction from the United States towards China-Cuba relationship, especially in the military relationship, because the United States itself now has diplomatic relations with Cuba. And so it will be in no way for the United States to oppose China's relationship with Cuba.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for joining us. That's Jia Xiudong joining us there from Beijing. And that is it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CCTV America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CCTV_America. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.